And lastly, I want to thank the research seminar series of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And so I will go ahead and share my screen so we can get right into it. So essentially, Hiding in Plain Sight, The Making of a White Argentine Republic, is a story about race and the construction of race, the racialization of Blackness, and overall, at least my goal is to continue to completely destroy the myth of Argentina being a white country. And ironically, this started out after I saw this. So picture it, this is 2014. This is the World Cup team that represents Argentina, and they are playing Germany in the finals. And I noticed the blogs kind of lighting up, Huffington Post, for example, Henry Louis Gates Jr., for example, writing for the Root. And they were all talking about where are the Black players? What happened to the Black players? Why are there no Black players in Argentina? This team in particular stood out because of the fact that every other South American team had at least a Black player that I want to stress is identifiable by US standards of Blackness. But Germany also had a Black player. So the question was, what happened to Argentina? Now, at this point in my career, I was halfway through writing another book project about Blackness, the experiences in the interior, legal identities, constructions, and such of ultimately the nation state. And so I was struck that in 2014, there was such an interest in this question. And it really hit me that at least amongst academic circles, primarily in Argentina, that have been studying Blacks for the past 30, 40 years, we had moved on from what happened to the Black population, because we had, for example, Reed Andrews, Emilio Endrick, 1967, Reed Andrews, 1980 in English, 89 in Spanish, address those questions. So we were like, or at least I was kind of struck that there was still such a disconnect between the general audience and academia. And at that moment, I said, you know what, there's a great opportunity then for me to hopefully address that question and provide, which at least in English would be the second book about Argentina and race, the Black population in 40 years. So imagine in English, Reed Andrew comes out with The Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires. 40 years later, 2020, here is something now to also continue to address that question of the Black population and ultimately what happened to them. I say in English because I want to stress that Argentine historians have been quite responsible and have done a very fantastic job, especially those in Cordoba, of discussing and delving into their respective Black histories. So with that, as I mentioned, I essentially stopped what I was doing, which was based off of my dissertation, and I decided to relook at Reed Andrews' book, as well as the great work done by historians in Argentina, and find out where were the gaps, essentially, and how I could continue to address that question, ultimately, of what happened to the Black population. And a few things happened. As I continued to work with what happened, I realized that was not the right question I was asking. The real question is, how was race ultimately formulated and created? And looking at and understanding then that it is very much a racialized process. And so I decided to look at it in two ways to kind of continue that conversation. One was to move beyond Buenos Aires, because as many of us know who do Argentina, 99.9% of the scholarship, especially when it comes to the Black experiences, are about Buenos Aires. The other was to make her, or women, Black women in particular, women of African descent, my central focus, ultimately making them protagonists in their own story. So Cordoba is where I decided to go. I decided to go west into the interior, as it's so commonly referred to. And I did this, again, as I mentioned, to go beyond BA, but also for us to recognize that Blackness, the creation of slavery, even the process of freedom is not homogeneous, right? So we have to recognize that the construction of race is very much built on social, economic, and political contexts upon which it is being created, fostered, and molded every day. And so that's what I realized, well, what exactly is Cordoba? And in many ways, it was the antithesis of Buenos Aires. It is a conservative, very traditional city. And I want to stress a very small city. And that, for me, is actually what allowed me to really get into the lives of these women, because ultimately from the late 16th century, which is what this actual map is based off of, the original map of Córdoba, Argentina, through the mid 19th century, this essentially is the size of the city, okay? And we're looking at, based off of the first census in 1778, a population roughly in the city of about 7,000, and it grows to roughly about 11. So at least for me, that made it a possibility for me to actually find my individuals on various occasions throughout their lives in the archive. So here we have a very conservative, very traditional, very small, and very Catholic city. One that even today there's jokes that essentially there's a church on every corner in Cordoba. It's clearly not that many, but there's definitely a different vibe in terms of the power of the church in Cordoba that is definitely absent in Buenos Aires even today. And so that is why I chose Cordoba, but then I also decided to move the time frame earlier. So rather than focus on the end of the 19th century, where there's the Blancamiento, the European immigration, I decided to not only look at Cordoba, but look at the end of the 18th, early 19th century to ultimately see where and how we could possibly get to a point where the final solution is to bring someone from outside in order to enhance the inside. And the second contribution that I put forward is that of focusing on Black women. And so I always show this image because I like to give credit where credit is due. This is from an Ebony article that was written. Ebony is, let me back up. Ebony is a magazine that is geared towards the Black population in the United States. And it was especially active in terms of the 60s and 70s of the civil rights movement. So here, this article came out in Ebony in 1976, and it was written by Era Bell Thompson, in which she, as a journalist, traveled down to Argentina with that question in mind. And she decided to feature a family of sisters, which is who you see right now, the Montero family. And it struck me that this is how she wanted to ultimately delve into questions of the vanishing Black population. But you see then these, again, sisters with the same parents, someone who's clearly identifiable as Black, at least by US standards, someone who would appear to be in the middle to be biracial by US standards, and then at the very end, with her very straight hair, you probably could not or would not identify her at all as being Black. And so kind of also showing that potential transition over time. But I decided to focus on her mainly because most of the information that has been written about the Black experience is very masculine. And especially with the bicentennial, in 2010, that is where, there was almost an explosion of articles that commemorated in one way, shape, or form the Black male experiences and contributions to the nation. And I felt, okay, there's enough. There's always can be more, but there's enough. But what about her? Why is she ultimately rendered as a victim based off of a very old myth that essentially white immigrants came to the country and there was no option for her, so miscegenation took place, almost as if this is all she ultimately did to contribute to the nation, contribute to a whitened nation at that. And I clearly was always troubled by that suggestion. And so in refocusing on her, I actually had to go back to my sources and do 2 more additional trips to Cordoba to make sure that I documented what she was doing, and particularly how she lived, how she labored, and how she loved. And in doing so, what I ended up having to do is to politicize the household, because that's where I found her. And I think that was very important then, to shift that conversation of not only a male masculine public display of Blackness, and such as cofradías and nations that existed, but to also then look at what that meant to be a part of a household, the political nature of the household, in many ways a microcosmic example of larger societal happenings, political happenings, economic back and forth, or reflections of the economy in many ways as well. So with that, what I discovered is, by looking at the household, there are a few main characters that came to being, and that were concubines, wives, mothers, and daughters. And by looking at their particular roles, I also had a chance to understand the creation of racial identities. So in particular, looking at concubines, one of the things that struck me was this brilliant case that I found, probably about 400 pages. And I'm now continuing this conversation piece where I've now found some more information about them in Bolivia, believe it or not. But here this woman named Bernabella Villamonte became a concubine of a priest. And what makes this fascinating is not so much that relationship, but how they express their relationship. And ultimately what we find is that she went from being noted as a slave, he purchased her and her daughter, but to a señora. And that transition was completely supported by this priest, Don Jose Lino de Leon is his name. So in order to do so, they broke sumptuary law. He ultimately bought her various types of jewels and gold, particularly jewelry, different types of silk that at that moment was very clear that mulatas and negras were not allowed to use, but he adorned her with this. They were caught on various occasions. And the main issue was, one, how dare he do this so publicly, going to her front door instead of her back, for example? How dare she embrace being a señora, demanding slaves bring her chocolate in bed, for example, and that he adamantly declared that they must call her señora. This performance of whiteness and the ability to ultimately emulate whiteness is what was so shocking. And again, the fact that he supported it, and at all costs. Ultimately, as I'm following this case, I believe he ends up becoming excommunicated from the church because he's just not willing to let her go. And what is also very interesting and telling about this case were the fact that they constantly noted that she was the color of a Spanish woman, and that these Spanish ladies were quite jealous of their privilege and their status that she constantly was emulating. And to be frank, if they hadn't gotten caught, most likely she would have been able to transition completely into the privileged status of whiteness or becoming a Spanish woman. In the end, what she ultimately was able to do was to have her daughter, Maria Gregoria, noted in the baptismal papers as being a Española. So that was key to her, and to her assent, was ultimately ensuring as a mother that her daughter would ultimately have that privileged status. But as I mentioned, being a concubine was always going to be a fickle and very precarious situation, unless, of course, you could become married. And in their case, that could never be. But there were instances of what they would call unequal relationships. So many, so to speak, that by 1776 and then ultimately 1778, the crown comes forward with the Royal Pragmatic, which tries to prohibit in one way, shape, or form, or at least discourage these unequal marriages, which included interracial marriages. It's ironic because in Cordoba, as historians have already noted, only 25 took place between a slave, a female slave, and a don, or a white Spanish man who was considered to be of elite. Only 25 in the course of a century, but yet that was too much. So here I have then this case coming forward, and one of the benefits, so to speak, of the case is that it does allow for couples who are intent on marrying to ultimately go to court to fight for the right to marry, because their parents initially had told them no, simply because they were underage and did not want this unequal marriage to happen. Well, now they can go to court, civil court, so essentially taking that out of the jurisdiction of the church, and fight for their right to marry. So when looking at what are these are known as marriage dissent cases, what I ended up doing was re-evaluating the verdicts. Now, again, because of the great work of Cordoba-based historians, the verdicts were already well known. In general, the majority of them would be granted yes versus no. All that was there. But once I divided it and looked at specifically women that were accused of mala sangre, I said, even though the majority are getting the yes answer, how is that happening? What are they doing? Is there something common in their argument? And what I found is that ultimately they claimed mistaken identity. So essentially, you have me mistaken for having mala sangre. I'm either Spanish, which wasn't a surprise, or Indian. And that shocked me to find that they found the loophole in the law that ultimately acknowledged that Indians could be considered distinguished Spanish men as a way, or men and women, excuse me, as a way to ultimately marry as well. And so I have this case, Emanuela Arrieta, who does just that. But of course, it's not just any Indian, right? She has to be of a descendant of noble Indians. And that is what she claims. And that, essentially her grandfather was a cacique. They were from La Toma, what was initially a encomienda, but eventually will become annexed by the city. All these things to claim and show that she was actually of indigenous descent. And that is what essentially allows her to marry this man named Manuel. Similarly, with being claims of being Spanish, right? It was in cases in which the woman did not claim either whiteness or being Indian that they were then denied the right to marry. Ultimately, she would use another tactic of being honorable or virtuous to show that she was worthy of the right to marry, but that did not work. So it's also very indicative then of Cordoba's notion of what is an ideal wife. And then I had this other opportunity to understand and look at motherhood and continue that conversation in terms of what does this mean and in the freeing process. And in particular, how she played a role in it. again, this is where it really struck me how different the geopolitical environments were for Cordoba and Buenos Aires, because at this point now we're looking at a transition into the Republican period. So roughly what I found for most of my cases would have been the early 19th century through the mid 1820s in regards to this question of motherhood and ultimately the freeing process. And what I found is, again, indigenous status was key to evading and or at times escaping enslavement. And that for me is very telling of the interior, because ultimately at the same time, if there were any types of contested freedoms in Buenos Aires, it was often because there was an abuse or an attempt to evade the law of gradual abolition known as the Free Womb Act that came about in 1813, which ultimately declared that babies born to enslaved mothers would now begin the process of freedom. Well, there would be various abuses, such as once they came of age, they were not freed. I didn't find any of this in Cordoba. And I honestly thought I was going to find it. I found one case of contested freedom based off of gradual abolition. Instead, the tactics that were used based off of people that were threatened with enslavement were to instead claim that they were indigenous and base it off of a centuries old law that ultimately declared that Indian bodies in labor was always free. But also an even older an older law that declared that the child followed the mother's status. So with those two in mind, what I found again was a brilliant case, Maria Guerra, in which ultimately by 1809, her, as she would say, employer died, and his children now were attempting to sell her. And she was on the ground, she made the statement that there's no way they can sell me because I was never enslaved. So similarly to some of the marriage descent cases, she then brought forth evidence of being indigenous. So for example, the clothing that she wore, the manta, that she was, her family was from the Pampas, as she would describe them, the southern part of the Cordoba's province, that they were Christianized, and that her family had been working for this particular family for generations. She cited her mother, for example, and her grandmother. And so she was saying, we have a familial relationship with them, but I've never been enslaved. They would counter and say, but your nickname is La Conga, for example. So what is this telling us in terms of you being of African descent? And witnesses went back and forth. I think what allowed for also her to take advantage of that time is clearly 1809, things are starting to get rumbling in Buenos Aires. And then we of course know that eventually they're going to be in the midst of the independence wars, one that Cordoba always objected to, in fact, began the counter-revolution initially. And even if they went along, there was always a bit of tension. I wouldn't say hatred, but tension with Buenos Aires for this forced independence. So from 1809 to 1817, it almost hung in the balance as she waited to hear back and forth what would happen. By 1817, she was then declared free. But because of these older laws, not only did she gain her freedom, but her kids gained their freedom, and then her grandchildren as well also were declared to be free. So we're seeing an entire family now shifting to becoming a free Indian. And I think this is also part of the whitening process. Or maybe, as I'm starting to think about it, maybe it's part of the anti-Blackness process, or this evasion, larger evasion of being Black in Cordoba. But again, we're starting to see that it's not just the Spanish notion of whiteness, but it's the privilege of freedom that they were seeking And they did so very differently than what would have worked in Buenos Aires. And then lastly, the daughters and understanding the upliftment process. I'm thinking of a recent book by Jessica Marie Johnson, in which she says, free status did not define freedom. And that is very true in this particular case. And this is what required an additional trip to Cordoba once I found this. Essentially, by 1811, Cordoba had opened a classroom for Pardo girls. That shocked me. So I did some digging and I discovered that by actually 1782, Cordoba had a school for girls, orphan girls in particular, elite orphan girls that would stay on campus. And then they provided a class for those that would have to commute. They were less of elite status, but they would also get schooling and they would learn about domestic chores. And ultimately, both groups would learn how to become what would be considered ideal mothers for the future. And this would continue with the Republican period. And in particular, this date of 1811, I think is very interesting too, because again, this is on the cusp of the beginnings of the independence movement. So by 1811, the same school then opens up this now classroom for free Pardo girls. And one of the things that I found, another great case, is a manumission case by Bernardina in 1816, so 5 years later, in which very much so her freedom or free status was not defined so much by freedom, but instead by an upliftment process, because her manumission was contingent on her going to that school and graduating. And so here we have then this larger process of understanding the upliftment process, and in particular, like how these Afro-descended women, or excuse me, girls would participate in this budding republic. That is, they would be Republican mothers, learn the particularities of motherhood, and ultimately transfer that to their sons, who legally could only be citizens. Girls were not legally allowed to be citizens, at least in the strictest sense, based off of the Constitution. So here again, I was fascinated by understanding how this worked for Cordoba. And again, something that was very different than Buenos Aires, because this was also within the jurisdiction of the church. And by the 1820s, the church and education was becoming quite a separate conversation in Buenos Aires. In Cordoba, not so much. So again, we had her then be a part of this class, a class that existed until 1858, so 5 years after the abolition of slavery in Cordoba, and become a part of this free Pardo class. What also fascinated me, and I think is the enduring legacy of this particular class, but in particularly the word Pardo, was that it was an encompassing label. Because I also found, because of the fact that it was such a small city, you know, cross-checking various sources, that Indigenous girls were also a part of this Pardo class. And so to me, and as I looked at the censuses over time, especially by 1832, it was almost as if the population was divided into what were known as, at this point, blancos or nobles, because Spanish is considered at this point a dirty word, or pardos, essentially formerly labeled casta people. And so these pardos then continue, at least for me, if we were to think beyond even the book, as a part of an othering process to allow us to understand what essentially happens to those that are not considered to be of European descent or of the immigrant population, especially as we move forward into the 19th century. it gives us, in a sense, as I close this talk, to really understand this movement of not just whiteness or moving to whiteness, but really it's the evasion, and I believe the continued process of rejecting Blackness that allows for Argentina to eventually become a quote unquote white nation. Thank you. I will stop sharing screen now.
Thank you very much, Erika. That was really interesting. I might kick off the round of questions. And I'm very interested in this transition from the use of the category of Indio, the legal category of Indio, to precisely advance the life chances of Black women. And I wanted to know, I wanted to ask you actually, because it occurred to me that there is, generally speaking, this understanding of also the Indian in Argentina as somebody who is outside the colonial society, right? It's in the desert in the south, or in the green desert in the north. But here you're also kind of putting it at the center of this process of or the establishment of a new racial formation in the Republican period that this is gearing towards the whiteness, right? So I wanted to ask you, once they achieve this new legal category, in which ways effectively their condition, their status change for these women, and also their everyday experiences, or it was just validating a new acquired material status, like in the case of Bernabella, in which she already had kind of the better life of being in a more kind of upper class position, but that provided some sort of legal validation?
Yeah, this great questions. So, I mean, immediately what it provides is her opportunity to marry the man that she loves, for example, or to evade capture and not being a slave. There are various instances also I found in which they would go back and forth about even being agregado or attached to the household. In this case, it was a black man who was arguing he is agregado to the church, but he was never a slave, and ultimately he was also Indian as well. So it's a question of labor, and the contract between the two as well is what they're ultimately negotiating. So it's this access to freedom and choice is what they immediately gain: choice to marry who they want to, and of course freedom in terms of their ability to social mobility. But I think what you're hitting on, and I think it's a very important aspect, is that the Indian, identity will become demonized, and it does. And I think that's also one of the reasons why I see these indigenous girls that are labeled Indian in the 1811 census by 1822 are Pardas. And that was shocking too. And I saw this again and again. I saw the complete erasure of a mestizo identity. It never really becomes something even in Cordoba, but the indigenous label is in 1840, there's an exception, and that's only because at that moment they've annexed La Toma. So you see this huge amount of indigenous peoples mentioned in the census. Other than that, they are also on this path of erasure. And I think it's to their benefit, because more and more of this, indigenous problem is coming apparent in terms of how they're going to fit in the republic, which is totally different than the colonial experience, where they are almost like a protected group on these pueblos and kind of considered to be, almost, I would say, patronizing in many ways in how they treated them. That protected status is clearly becoming a problem. So I think all that in combination is what ends up taking place.
Mm-hmm, yeah, thanks. We have a question from Antonio in the chat. Erika, can you give us some demographics? What was the size of the Black population that was whitened?
So in Cordoba, I can give you Cordoba, yes. So essentially by the 1778, you're looking at this is all census data, so some of it is obviously skewed, but you're looking at roughly about 8,000 people in the city. Then it was the 1813 census, not 1811 census, and you're looking at about 9 to 10,000. And by the 1840 census, it's about 11 to 12,000 people in the city. And within that, by 1778, you're looking at roughly about 2,500 free and or enslaved people together, that I would argue would be considered African descent. And then by 1813, that roughly stays about the same. It's really in the 1822 census and definitely the 1832 census where it's actually harder to trace them by color, but instead by status, by enslavement, you're starting to see that it's roughly about 500 people that are enslaved. So that's the way I started to look at it. It couldn't be based off of the color or the phenotype, which was still mentioned, but to actually look at the property, quote unquote, that was always going to be listed in, I think, more accurate. So you're looking at a sharp decline over time. And essentially, if you were to look at the color, by 1832, it's half Pardos and half Blancos / Nobles. So, and I would say that if you were to look at the Black population by then, it's less than 2%. So I hope that helps. This is all off the top of my head. I hope that helps.
Ben, you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for your wonderful talk, Erika. And nice to meet you also in person.
Nice to meet you, Ben. Yes.
So I was really struck by the claim that this case of Maria Guerra that she was making to say, call me a free Indian and sort of changing racial categories. And then sort of your ultimate argument to this evasion of certain labels. And I was just struck by a similarity over time. So Oscar Chamosa has this article, I think in HAHR, about how about 100 years later, around 1900, that all these intellectuals start de-indigenizing Argentina, so getting rid of the label of Indio and start calling the same populations over time criollos or morochos. So there's, again, sort of a very similar process of label changing, which sort of, by changing the label, it's a way to slowly just sort of make everyone white, right? By just sort of getting rid of all the racial labels. So I was just sort of struck by this similarity between this other research about a period 90 years later and what you're describing. And how that might help us also understand how this myth of the 2014 world, the 2014 Argentina soccer team comes into being. And so I was just wondering what you think about that. Is it fair to link what you've just said to that broader process, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Definitely. I think it is. It's the beginning of what will become very much part of this erasure of Blackness and in indigeneity in Argentina. It's the creation of, and you hinted to, this criollo, right? Which then has some level of a colonial connotation and meaning pre-immigrant, right? But then does that mean that they're also indigenous or not? That's always a little bit questionable. To morochos, which is a more commonly, nickname or label that I myself was called while living there, on more so than even negro. That's what shocked me even more. People were more comfortable with calling me morocha or mulata. And when I would try to correct them and say it's okay to say Black, they say, but you're not physically Black. So, that's part of that process too. Other nicknames like trigueño, that became also a very important label that was put forward, especially in Buenos Aires. So yeah, I think this is all looking at the beginnings of this othering process. And you see this in an earlier period, and that's what I wanted to highlight by going to an earlier period beyond the onslaught of European immigrants to show that this was already beginning. Even more so, I started to compare some of the writings of Sarmiento and found with San Alberto, who is the person who created the orphanage, they had the same concerns about education, about the Pampas, about this ignorance that was happening, the questions of, what would be, the civilization versus barbarism. That's already beginning in Cordoba by the end of the 18th century. So yeah, I think that's part of it. And you know, if we were to look at that picture again of the soccer team, football team, you could clearly see not all of them look phenotypically white, but yet they can be a part of this whiteness process. I mean, the person that embodies this the most is, you know, may he rest in peace, Maradona, who is clearly not white, but yet extolled as the person, right? The God for Argentina. And so I think that's part of how you can look at someone who physically does not meet the standards of whiteness, but can ultimately become part of this whitening process. And that's what I think also is very unique to Argentina because of that. And I really saw that difference because I had been going back and forth for 20 years in Argentina, first VA, and then when I shifted over to Cordoba, it really hit home in the interior, where I found more what they would describe as morochos or darker skinned peoples, but still this kind of extolled notion of whiteness, right? It was very telling of how that works in the interior. Thank you. And nice meeting you, Ben.
Thanks.
So it's Avijami and then Peter.
Thank you so much for this really engaging talk. You have very interestingly described how some strategies and tactics towards whitening, such as claim of errors by Afro-descendant people in the register of their children's racial classification for their official records, which resonates with some cases registered in Mexico for the period. Mm-hmm. Or how using the word Black is still avoided as much as possible in other countries, like in Argentina and Mexico as well, in favor of the use of morocho or moreno. So my question is about the transnational influences and ideas about race and Blackness, and whether there was like an influence or a rejection in the production of racial categories in Argentina. For example, whether disruptions, influences in the way it was publicly discussed, how Blackness was built or silenced, and how it was preferred in comparison with Colombia or Peru or other countries in Latin America. And is, for example, pardaje compared to other narratives and practices of mixture, such as mestizaje in other Latin American countries. Thank you so much.
Okay. These questions definitely go a little beyond what I do, but I will try to give a bit of an assessment of understanding. I think from what I understand, this question of rejection of Blackness is in the racialization process. Is that what you're asking, just to clarify?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I think what we have to recognize, and this is what was a hard truth for me, was to see that this clear rejection of Blackness that takes place and is almost solidified by the end of the 19th century, where you have various intellectuals, you know, supposedly Sarmiento says, if you want to see a Black person, you have to go to Brazil at that point. What I had to really accept was that this was also something that Indigenous and Afro descendants also partook in. And so I think we have to have that hard conversation of seeing what that means for them to also reject in some way, shape, or form their own Blackness. And so this is where you see these labels coming forward that clearly could be, you know, something that is put on them, but in other ways, this is something that they also would adopt because they too recognize affiliation with Blackness does not give you any favors. It does not garner any level of privilege. It definitely doesn't do anything for status. And so this removal process is both top down as well as bottom up. And I think that's something that we have to constantly acknowledge in this process. And it's up through the 1980s that I would say it's both up, down, up, bottom up and top bottom. So that to me is the first thing I want to stress. And then of course you have some great works like Ignacio's that's coming out and talking about this darkening process. And so that's a very recent conversation that is happening, and especially a very recent conversation for the Black activists in Argentina that are now taking on and holding on to their Blackness and claims of Blackness. And of course, the diasporic understandings of Blackness. This is very new. This is, and especially with the recent immigrations of African migrants to immigrants to Argentina, that's something very new, but it's part of that process, so reminding us in many ways that that's the exception to the rule. And instead you have a long legacy of rejection of Blackness. And in doing so, a rejection of Blackness and mixture, they become what is known as a homogeneous nation. And that's also something that scholars have been talking about. And this homogeneity is essentially a standardized, status quo of whiteness. And this acceptance of, if you are not a descendant of a European immigrant, then you are something else that is not quite Argentine, or at least not Argentine enough. And so that's why you see, especially when you're looking at, as you mentioned, this, miscegenation being celebrated in the 30s, 40s, to some extent the 50s, that's not what happens in Argentina. The notion is that it's still very much a white country, a homogeneous country. And it's to a point where I think it would be interesting that we could not have a whiteness studies process or conversation or critical conversation in Argentina, because I think it's so much like the standard, right? There's you as being something different, but being white is just the norm. And I think that is also something that we have to have a conversation, an actual interrogation of what is whiteness and breaking down that process in order for us to really get at how this homogeneity has been such a successful project. And that being said, it has been done. It's just beyond my scope of research. But I think of Ezekiel Adamowski, I think I might be saying his name wrong, but he's definitely done a lot of good work on that process, the racialization process of the 20th century. Paulina Alberto, Eduardo Elena, they have, rethinking race in Argentina for the 20th century to really get at that racialization process, to try again to poke holes into that ability to continue to manifest and maintain homogeneity, which like I mentioned, until recently, with the recent, I shouldn't say the recent, but 2001 crisis, which just kind of blew everything up, Argentina was very much considered to be the exception and always exception to the rest, I mean, look at what the president just said recently. Oh my gosh, the Spanish prime minister.
About the boats.
Oh my goodness, but it showed, right? Argentines are from a boat. Brazilians are from the jungle. Mexicans are from Indians. Again, this separation is still very much there. So thank you.
Thank you.
Pete?
Yeah, thanks, Erika. That was really, really fascinating. And I think my question is about, obviously it was very interesting that people used to claim the idea of indigenous ancestry, at least, as a way to avoid Blackness, because that relates to, was that really a symbolic claim, or what do we know about the actual social status of being an indigenous person in Cordoba or in that area at the time? Was it actually, was that a good status to have? Because if we think about Argentina and their relationship to indigeneity as a nation, that's a history of genocide, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe not quite as early as the late 18th century, but certainly after that. Being an indio was, by no means a very good thing to be. So is the point that being identified as an esclavo or a negro was even worse? Presumably it was. So that's one question, was, what was the actual status of an indigenous person at the time? And then I'm also interested to know, I mean, maybe you can't answer this question because you're focused, very specifically on Cordoba, but do you have any indications of whether that tactic of claiming indigenous ancestry was used more widely in Argentina, for example, in the north of Argentina, which had presumably at that time a fairly large Black, in inverted commas, population? Was it also a tactic to be used there? And yeah, then I suppose it would be interesting to think about, was it a tactic that was used more widely right across Spanish America, in the late colonial period? I mean, I think of the Pacific coastal region of Colombia, which I know. I mean, even now you will find a lot of people who look, entirely African, saying, "Oh yeah, I've got an indigenous grandmother." You're thinking, well, why is that a sort of? Are they making that claim, or is that just a statement of fact about indigenous Black into marriage or into relationships in the region, or are they trying to make a claim to distance themselves from Blackness? So yeah, that. And then just finally, I mean, I'm thinking of also Verena Martinez Allier's work on 19th century Cuba, where she was looking at the way that people used to try and force the hand of their parents and the authorities when they were trying to marry, or at least have relationships, or specifically marry across racial and class lines, but specifically racial lines. So they would then elope together in order to force the hand of disapproving parents, because once they'd eloped, in order to save their honor, then the parents would agree, oh, well, if you're going to be together, then at least get married, sort of thing. Yeah. So that was one way in which they managed to force the approval process. And I just wondered if you came across anything like that.
Okay, this is a good list. So the very easy question in terms of whether or not Blacks claimed indigenous identities to evade capture in other parts of Argentina, I don't know. I don't know. There is some work, however, recently by Florencia Guzman, who was interrogating and looking at census data and was shocked to find that there was a lack of Zambos. That was not there. They were either noted as being I think mulattos or negros. So that's telling, at least, and I believe it was somewhere in the northwestern part of Argentina that she was looking at. But as far as, indigenous status in Cordoba, I think what we have to recognize is the separation of what is civilized versus what is not civilized. And those that were considered civilized and that worked in the city, that were Christian, there is definitely a benefit to them clearly not being Black. And that's, of course, not to say that social conditions are, that much better, right? Oftentimes what we would find, as I believe you'd find that too, they're working alongside many slaves, in the city, as well as freed people in the city. But there is a protected sense of, not protected, but there is a benefit if you're considered to be, civilized and or living on your pueblo like you're supposed to, versus, and they constantly will show this, the indigenous attacks from they would call them from the Pampas, that, that is what will eventually become the true, problem to progress. That's always there. And I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, there's always that threat and that Indian problem. But then you have within the city, you have a sizable indigenous population that is there, that is working. And so, and they fight a lot for their rights, especially La Toma, which is, right by the city. And when the city starts to encroach on the land, and especially access to their water, they fight for it, and they petition and they work through the process in order to get access, or at least claim and have that autonomy, so the city doesn't ultimately take over completely. So there is definitely ways in which they can seek legal redress that is there as well. Is it better to be indigenous than Black? I would say yes, if you are a civilized indigenous person. If you're considering to be still the problem of the state, you know, then no. And I think that's also why we also have to look at then how and why Indigenous identity becomes part of this Pardo process over time too. They recognize over time that being associated with Indian and being in the city cannot continue the same way. There's going to be this negative connotation because you are constantly still dealing with those from the Pampas, as they would call that, the indigenous attacks don't stop. So I think that's part of it too. But it's not overall my focus, even though I'm starting to go in that direction, because that's also still lacking in research about the early Republican period. In terms of larger Black and Indian interactions, and I think also this kind of movement away from Blackness, I think it's there. I definitely do. And and one of the advantages of being of African descent and easily identifiable as African descent is that at times that comes directed at me as well. And so when I was living, for example, in Ecuador, you're not to identify me as a Zamba, meaning
Sorry,
Black and white.
you froze just then. Can you go back about 15 seconds or 20 seconds?
Sure.
When you were living in Ecuador.
Oh, okay. That wasn't that far then. Okay. So when I was living in Ecuador, as I was mentioning, it's a unique opportunity to be of African descent and also a scholar in Latin America, to have those interactions on a daily basis. As no one ever believes I'm a scholar. But it definitely is eye-opening that there is where, again, I was no longer Black. Instead, I became a Zamba. So you see this kind of removal to, again, kind of make me become less of a Black person. I would say almost similar to what was happening in Argentina. So I do think that there's still some levels of advantages to being Indigenous rather than being Black, of course, based off of the context that you're in. I think it allows for kind of this, as we saw even with the photo of the Argentine national team, I would argue some of them would be mestizos in other countries. I don't think that would be afforded to someone who looked clearly Black, but in Argentina, to have that same kind of space of whiteness and privilege. So, and in terms of 19th century Cuba, for my marriage descent cases, I only found 2 instances in which they attempted to elope, but they were actually caught in the process. I didn't include that in my study because in this case, it involved Spanish women and Afro-descended men. And in both cases, because they were caught prior to actually be eloping and attempting to marry, they were denied. They were denied that access to it, even though her honor had definitely been compromised.
Okay.
Definitely
Thank you.
at that point. So thank you for these great questions.
Erika, I have another question. When does the category of Pardo starts to be phased out from official classifications from the language of the state?
So Pardo, and in general, Blanco too, and we had a great discussion about Blanco. By the 1850 census, for sure, they are no longer really noting anything. Actually, by 1840, you don't really see that conversation piece, but by the mid-19th century, that is where it's difficult to follow their lives. But because Cordoba was so conservative, we do have the baptismal, marriage, and death certificates that continue to have separate books. So you have one for the Españoles, and then you have one for everybody else. And those continue until about the 1870s in Cordoba. The issue is though, within the book for everyone else, they no longer note everybody's race like they did before in the 18th, early 19th century, but they're put in that book. So, you know, that's another attempt, at least if we, you know, to try and trace that process. But yeah, by definitely the mid 19th century, that is where it's starting to no longer be discussed. And I found in Cordoba, in the school records, they had a listing of blancos and de color is how they referred to them. And so I thought that was an interesting find. It was beyond what I was doing, but I was like, that's de color, maybe another category that was used to, again, everybody else that was in Cordoba. So.
Virginia or Virginia, I don't know how to pronounce your name. You have a question?
Yeah, Virginia is fine. Thank you so much. I'm so excited. Thank you so much, Professor Edwards. It was such a fascinating talk. I'll try to be quick, although I think I had so many questions. But I think one that was sort of striking me, I mean, the question of the mestizo, how were they placed in Cordoba? What happened to them? I mean, did you find records? Excuse me. I mean, I was thinking about Joanne Rappaport, the disappearing mestizo.
Yeah.
You know, and the question that, you know, it was difficult to identify mestizos because they didn't really belong to a specific category. So I was sort of thinking, even in all these convent records, you know, when they were, you know, listing the children, you know, like white or Españole or, you know, or Indian, etc. Could they be sure if the children were sort of orphans or were brought in by non-relatives? So how could they sort of categorize them? And in a way, this is linked to what you were saying about the court, the trials, you know, how could they prove their case, you know, like, oh, but I am from an Indian ancestry, you know, how could they be successful? And if you have found records of people who were not successful, if they explained why they were rejected in their claims. I don't know if it makes sense. Maybe it's a bit confused, but.
No, it does. I'm just writing their claim. Okay, so I think that remains a mystery, especially in Argentina. Clearly, there are, if we were to, in the strictest sense, miscegenation that takes place between indigenous peoples and Spaniards. Yes, and so we would, in most places, label them as being mestizos. And I did find, as I looked at earlier documents, and especially when I, you know, was laying the foundation of the demographics of the city in the 16th century, you do see that use of mestizo. And that's used in many ways, I think, to have more, to provide in many, as it did in other places, this kind of political, cultural exchange and back and forth of the two cultures coming together in many ways. And similar to other places too, I did find in Cordoba that for some elite conquistadors, they did acknowledge, and they would say they're mestizo sons or they're mestizo daughters. But somewhere along the line of the 17th and 18th century, the word in itself is just dropped. It is not used that often. So even with the census category in of 1778, they don't even use the word mestizo. I to be responsible, instead of this 500 plus people that are considered part of the city, most likely are some of them are mestizos, but you just don't find a true category of that population really represented in the city census. And I have to stress that. Now, maybe if we looked at provincial census data, you know, that may be different in other parts of Cordoba. So there may be just that I don't have access to those sources, which may be using mestizo, One thing I did find is at times mestizo would be interchangeable with mulatto. And that was shocking to me as well. And so some scholars in in Cordoba then referred to kind of this process as Afro-mestizaje, or Afro-mestizos would be a label that they used to describe Afro descendants. I don't agree with it, so I didn't use it, but that is a term that was provided by some of my colleagues in Cordoba. So in terms of these court cases, and I guess especially in looking at the marriage descent cases, it really is a reflection of what is calidad in the colonial period, which is beyond just phenotype. It's also how you dress, it's where you live, it's your occupation, and most importantly, it's the confirmation of others. Other people are determining your status and your identity. So it is about, you know, performances, you know, like Bernabella, who, if she had been caught, would be easily a dona if it wasn't for the fact that he was a priest, which is a problem. And I would say that would be it, because otherwise they could have been married. And as I also saw for some of these cases, not even cases, but in marriage files, I would find women who were born negra would move to another town, become mestiza, move to another town, or by the time they got back to the city, were now doñas. This is one person, her lifetime. So it's really showing the flexibility of calidad, which is amazing. And so I think that's what was happening. You get the right witnesses to claim that they know of certain types of indigenous cultures, the way they dress, how they labored, all things that are quote unquote identifiable as being an Indian, and that's a tactic that they would use. But like I said, the rejected ones, right? These African descended women that never claimed that they were either Spanish or a mistaken identity in general, those are the ones that were not allowed to marry in the end. And it was always because there's too much of a inequality between the two. That is how they would, ultimately they would uphold the parents' concerns in regards to their marriage.
Okay, so Danielle has one last question, and with this we wrap up the discussion.
Hi, hello. So Professor Edwards, thank you so much for your presentation, and also to the other participants for your questions. I found them very interesting and informative for my own project. And so I don't really have a question. It's more about if you have a comment on this, because I think it's my project is focusing on contemporary events, and specifically I'm working with the Marea Verde feminism throughout Latin America, but specifically what sparks from Argentina. And as you mentioned before, now we see that there is a lot of contestation and reivindication of Blackness and indigeneity. Mm-hmm. And there is a big tension with feminism, and specifically the Marea Verde feminism, because of the Eurocentric white tradition of that feminism, of the leaders, and specifically because they are almost all from very urban, middle-class, white, highly educated Buenos Aires. So there is a lot of tension there. Mm-hmm. What I'm finding in this research, but also living on the ground and talking to fellow activists, is that there is now in certain circles a tendency for women, specifically cisgender women, who could be considered white because of their class, because of their trajectory, because also of their descendants and how they have come to understand themselves so far, to take on some kind of mestiza attributes. So they start to identify as mestiza, they start to dress in certain ways, they start to talk in certain ways, and so on and so forth. Sometimes they can argue for some kind of lineage, so blood. And we are finding that not all the time, but often this is used as in US frames, it would be called like white fragility. So it's actually lacking to address some of the consequences of how they have been so far and what repercussions they have. And I understand this is not maybe your focus, but I was curious if you have a comment on this. this kind of reversal of.
Just so I can, so one was the issue of feminism and it being kind of this white middle class viewpoint is one thing that you were saying. And then there's also then a reclaiming of various indigenous or mestizo backgrounds by some of these also. Is that middle class white women? Is that what trying to encapsulate?
Yeah, I'm going to reformulate. So within the context of feminism,
yes.
Within that context, where there is a claim to sorority and other similar things, many white women are actually taking on a certain type of cultural appropriation to claim themselves as mestizas.
Yes.
Or half indigenous or half Afro-descendant or indigenous descendant as a way to avoid working with what whiteness has meant and what whiteness means in the country and in their work. And I was wondering if you have, well, just a comment.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Wow, that's a great question because I am very familiar with that tension you described. When I'm in Argentina, I have to wear both hats, right? One is being a scholar and academic, where I am typically the only Black PhD in a room discussing things. And then I flip the other hat on as I'm just a Black woman in the street getting cat calls like everybody else and just as nervous about my safety at times. So it's interesting to have to do with both, and because of that latter reality that I had to face, I became very much involved as a supporter of the Black movements in Argentina and had to, and grateful that I befriended so many African descendants in Argentina. And that's where I was very much introduced to that tension of Black women who just felt the feminist movement is not listening whatsoever to their needs. And it's still there, you know, you can still hear the back and forth. And so this appropriation in some ways of what maybe 20 years ago, they would never, maybe 30 years ago would have never claimed or discovered their Black or indigenous back class are now being used is quite, I think, annoying to some of these Afro-descended and indigenous peoples in which they cannot take off that veil and put it back on if they want to, right? So this, in some ways, is what we're also experiencing in the United States as well. Various people that have appropriated, especially an indigenous past, in order to gain access to school, or especially school. And it's now, you know, it's coming to light. The most famous case of this, if we have to move a little bit into what recently happened, is Warren, Elizabeth Warren. And she had claimed for years that she knew she was indigenous. And so she understood that back and forth process and comes to light, you know, and then even proud to show that she's less than a percentage Indian and somehow that's still Indian when she did a DNA test. And you know, indigenous people and people of color like myself were like, oh, stop talking, like, don't do this to yourself because it's so insulting. So I can speak more from that advantage and just add to the fact that for those that are also in Argentina who cannot escape, you know, and or evade, put on or off whether or not they're indigenous or Black. And I won't deny, maybe these women do have it in them, right? I'm not, but that doesn't make you politically a Black person or an indigenous person, right? That there's more to this, you saying you have Indian blood or Black blood to make you African descendant or indigenous. And that's the insulting aspect, is clearly they're still not comprehending what it means, the racialization process and what that actually means. And that's still going to be a problem, you know. It's very insulting to do that. So I think it's an engaging conversation piece. It is showing, as Ignacio's work has spoken to, this darkening process of this recently happening in Argentina. It's now cool to have some levels or potentially understand or see Argentina as multicultural, but even within that understanding, unless you really get at the roots of what is racism and the racialization process, it's just, you know, glossed over process that it's not going to solve anything. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Okay, so we, Erika must be very tired now with all these questions. I really would like to thank you again for the paper. The presentation was really great. It was very fascinating. You brought back painful memories with that photo of Argentina, because now I remember that much, but it was all worth it because it was really a great talk. And I would like to thank everybody for coming. We are having our next seminar on the 24th of November, this time on campus. You can find all the details online. It's by Abeyami, right, Pete? By
Abeyami, yes.
Yeah. So if you go to our website, you can find the details of the room, etc. Once again, Erika, thank you so much for this great talk. And
yeah, thanks, Erika. Really good. Thank you.
And as I wrote, I'm now looking at everybody's, you know, comments in the chat and individual messages of, you know, thank you for your kind words and thank you for sharing this space. It's always a pleasure. And thank you both, Peter and Ignacio, for allowing me to share my work. And Peter, I think you've got me thinking more and more about this Indigenous question, which is definitely something that needs to be addressed. So yeah, thank you all, everyone, for your comments and questions. Thank you.
okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.